I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
And we're back with more No Man's Sky. It's been a year since one of the most disappointing launches of the generation. In that year, Hello Games has been at work attempting to salvage their game and save Sean Murray's reputation by patching in many of his broken promises. We've seen numerous bug fixes and 4 major updates, the latest of which, Atlas Rises, being released only yesterday. I went back and put in about 18 hours between now and then, hoping that No Man's Sky might finally be something resembling what we were promised. It's no secret how much I hated this game at launch. The game was an almost unplayable mess, lacking anything to do beyond mining for plutonium and offering more bugs and game-ending crashes than a Bethesda release. In a very real sense, it reflected space almost too well. Vast and empty. Hello Games kept at it though, refining the engine and adding base building, land vehicles, and freighters, and yet the galaxy still felt pretty empty. There were things to do, sort of, but no real reason to do any of it. Space archaeology seems like a great idea, but a simulation of the tedium of archaeology is not what gamers wanted, nor what they were promised. And if the idea was a galactic sandbox in which players could forge their own stories, then they needed greater freedom to actually make the story their own. Minecraft offers players a set of building blocks and tells them to do whatever the hell they want, which, love or hate the game, has resulted in some unbelievable creations. No Man's Sky gives players an almost infinite world and tells them to go look at it. Even the base building feels hollow, as players are limited to just the structures already designed by the developers, leading to bases that all look more or less the same. There's no place made for the player, just the pieces. Which brings us to Atlas Rises, the most significant update to the game thus far. Prior to launch, Hello Games used an ARG called Waking Titan to drum up the hype this time around, which was probably a good idea since having Sean Murray talk about the update would probably have led to players polishing their pitchforks all over again. I won't talk about everything the update changes, there is simply too much to cover everything. I'm going to focus on 3 main areas: cosmetics, gameplay, and narrative. In terms of graphics, No Man's Sky is beautiful. At launch, the game wasn't bad looking, but it was bland. Textures were not especially interesting, landscapes were often very barren, and the less said about the creatures, the better. Hello Games has been steadily improving the graphics, but they really nailed it this time around. Textures are much more varied and pleasing, and environments are lush and vibrant, much closer to that original trailer, and there are rocks everywhere. I know that sounds ridiculous, but barren planets now have a much better scattering of rocks, and that goes a long way to making the environments look natural. The interface is largely unchanged, unfortunately, except for the pause menus, which are tweaked to accommodate the gameplay changes. But like the rest of the interface, those menus are very clunky and not much fun to use. In terms of sound, the new effects really got on my nerves. There is often way too much noise going on, to the point where it actually drowns everything out. There were times where I wasn't sure what I was listening to. The new music is also not very good. I like the original soundtrack, but many of the added tracks are much more aggressive and don't really fit the game as well as the original tracks did. In terms of gameplay, there is now a guild system tied to a mission system. At each space station, you can go to the teleporter room and select from a number of missions to do for money or blueprints or, God forbid, nanites. This is a really great addition that is marred by some serious flaws. First, the missions are very repetitive. Craft and deliver an item, scan something, kill something, find something. That's about it. Now, I really enjoyed some of the missions. I loved being told to exterminate planetary creatures. I'd go down to the planet and run around screaming, "Exterminate! Exterminate!" while hunting down those little screaming creatures. But then there are missions where I had to find a missing person and convince them to go home. Except, I didn't really do that. All I could do was go and find the missing person, who was conveniently marked on my map for me, and activate a homing beacon. I never got an opportunity to learn why the person was missing or to try and talk them into doing something. That was a missed opportunity. And then there are some of the crafting missions, which are just nightmares, because you have to craft rare items out of really rare elements, and the game does not tell you what you have to craft until after you've accepted the mission, and it's stuck forever in your mission log. The other flaw with the mission system, however, is the guild system. Now, I'm assuming this is a massive bug in the software, but I did a lot of missions. A lot of guild missions. There is a difference. And I got credit from the guilds for less than a quarter of them. They were marked as completed, and I got payment for all of them. But most of the time, I would either get credit from the race or the guild, but not both, or not get credit at all. Like I said, I assume that this is a bug because if the system is operating correctly, there are some weirdly esoteric rules governing it. We also finally got functioning portals! I haven't messed around with them too much, but I did use one outside of the main story, and yes, it did work, and it was pretty cool. I'm actually surprised at how exciting that moment was for me, and I think the portals will open up the world in very interesting ways, especially given, the next item on my list. I do need to mention that the portals are stargates. It's not a question, it's not an homage, they are literally stargates, right down to the glyphs and the way the inner ring spins. I love Stargate, but come on! First 2001 A Space Odyssey and now Stargate? Try using your imagination now and then, Sean. Multiplayer! Yes, you can now see up to 15 floating orbs representing other players in your game world. Interaction is severely limited at this point, but we do have multiplayer! Look, this is one thing that should not have been in this update. It's not even a half-assed implementation. I think multiplayer could change the game completely in the future, especially with the portal systems now being activated. But I think introducing it this way is Sean Murray's way of saying, yeah, I know I promised multiplayer, so here's your bleepin' multiplayer, I hope you choke on it. I think it would have been a better idea to not say anything about it being in this update, just leave it in there as a structural foundation to build upon in later patches. But as the multiplayer is now, I just have to ask, why? Who cares? Last but not least, the narrative. Yes, No Man's Sky now has a proper story to it, and not just the half-baked Atlas path, which apparently has been changed, but as I'd already completed it, the game is not letting me do the updated version, even though it does appear in my mission log for some reason. I planned on talking quite a bit about the new storyline because it is interesting and for the most part well done, but I think players really do need to experience it for themselves. There were numerous moments in the story where, because nothing had been published online about the story yet, I was completely in the dark as to the consequences of my choices, and that was an awesome feeling. Those were some emotional moments for me in a game that is otherwise quite sterile. Just to give you an overview though, the story has actual characters that feel like characters, not mouthpieces for simulation theory. Nada and Polo are part of the story, although you can encounter them outside of the story, and that makes for a really weird dissonance. The story also has real dialogue, conversation trees, sort of, player choice, and multiple endings. The endings aren't anything spectacular, they are pretty anticlimactic really, which is disappointing predominantly because the game leads you to believe one of the endings will be very definitive, a literal end to the game. And I was actually expecting something very specific to happen to my game when I got to that point. And this something would have been incredibly ballsy, but instead it was just another anticlimax. And There are 2 sections in the middle of the story that really slow things down and are, quite frankly, boring. But that being said, the story is pretty good, and it went a long way towards pushing me back into the game and then through it. All in all, is No Man's Sky a good game? No, not really. But it's not a bad game either. At launch, yes, the game was bad. But now, I'm having a hell of a good time, and a hell of a lot more fun than I had at launch. It's definitely flawed, and some of those flaws probably are never going to get fixed. They're never going to go away. But for 18 hours, I felt a genuine sense of forward momentum, that I was actually doing something in this game for once. It was a much fuller satisfaction than, congratulations, you just walked 10,000 units! I can honestly say, yes, I now recommend No Man's Sky. If you haven't played it, it's on sale pretty much everywhere for, I think, $25. Go out and try it, if you're at all interested. If you did play it and you gave up on it a year ago, go back, give it a second look. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. I know I sure as hell was.
Pomegranate.